Many people who had become addicted to painkillers turned to shady pill mills, pain clinics with rogue doctors to write fraudulent prescriptions, and complicit pharmacists to fill them. One-stop shopping for controlled narcotics.
Pain clinics overnight popping up off an entrance ramp or an exit ramp on an interstate, and all of a sudden there's a pain clinic there.
Had you ever seen anything like that before?
Never. In fact, it was my opinion that this made the whole crack epidemic look like nothing. These weren't kids slinging crack on the corner. These were professionals who were doing it. They were just drug dealers in lab coats.
That was part of a 60 Minutes investigation with the Washington Post that aired last night on the forces behind the nation's opioid epidemic. The man we just heard from is the former chief of the DEA's Office of Diversion Control. He was responsible for cracking down on doctors, pharmacies, drug manufacturers, and distributors who skirted the nation's prescription drug laws. The DEA began bringing enforcement actions against distributors, and the companies ended up paying hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. Then, as the Washington Post reports, in April 2016, at the height of the deadliest drug epidemic in U.S. history, Congress effectively stripped the Drug Enforcement Administration of its most potent weapon against large drug companies suspected of spilling prescription narcotics onto the nation's streets. Joining us now is the Washington Post's Scott Higham, one of the reporters who conducted the investigation. Thank you for being on the show. Let's try and spell this out. It's complicated. Who is the whistleblower? Who is this whistleblower? And what exactly is he alleging?
Good morning, guys. His name is Joe Rannazzisi, and we came across him during the course of an investigation. My partner on this story, Lenny Bernstein, was trying to get answers to questions about why so many people were dying from opioid overdoses, and where were all these drugs coming from. And he began to make a lot of phone calls, do kind of gumshoe reporting, checking out court records, calling as many people as he could. And he came across this guy named Joe Rannazzisi, who had been forced out of his job at the DEA, and he ran the Diversion Control Division, like you said, and that's the division that oversees the pharmaceutical industry at the DEA. And he felt that he could not do his job at the height of this epidemic, and he was forced out of his job in the face of intense pressure from the pharmaceutical industry on Capitol Hill that was reaching into the DEA, that was reaching into the Department of Justice. And we began to interview other people out in the field, DEA investigators, men and women, very dedicated investigators who said that their cases were being slowed down. And so suddenly we found ourselves kind of in the middle of seeing the opioid wars from the front row between the DEA and the pharmaceutical industry and members of Congress, and the DEA was losing, shockingly.
And these pain clinics that were popping up everywhere, tell us how they emerged into the story.
Well, the epidemic began with internet pharmacies, and those were quickly shut down. You could literally get a prescription for OxyContin, Oxycodone, Vicodin with bogus prescriptions, and you could just send them into a pharmacy online and get them shipped to your house. The DEA shut those down. As soon as they shut those down, these pain clinics began to pop up all over the place, and they were rogue doctors, shady pharmacists. You'd walk in, you'd pay $200–300 for a prescription, and you'd walk out with a vial of Oxycodone. And there were so many people doing this. These parking lots in South Florida, all across the country, were just filled with drug dealers, drug users, people in vans and beat-up cars and driving down I-75 from West Virginia and Ohio to get their drugs and bring them back up to their communities and selling them on the street for great profit.
Mark.
Scott, did anybody get rich off of this?
I mean, a lot of people got rich, all the way from drug dealers on the streets and all the way up to the pharmaceutical companies. I mean, this is a $13 billion a year industry. So a lot of people were making a lot of money, and a lot of people were turning a blind eye to what was happening.
Did they lobby Congress to try to keep that branch from doing anything about it?
Of course. The pharmaceutical industry, we found, Joe, spent about $106 million lobbying on this bill and other legislation in Capitol Hill. And it was also written by an industry lawyer. And you were up there on the Hill, and I would imagine you saw some of this firsthand. Lobbyists write a lot of legislation, and a lot of times it doesn't have a huge impact. But to write a piece of legislation at the height of the opioid epidemic that takes away the DEA's most important enforcement tool kind of takes your breath away.
So tell us about the bill that exacerbated the problem and who was behind it.
So Tom Marino was the principal sponsor of this legislation. It was written, like I said, by an industry lawyer. And basically the DEA's most effective enforcement tool is something called the immediate suspension order. And so those are used for times when there are companies that are sending downstream hundreds of millions of pills unchecked. The DEA steps in and says, enough is enough, we're shutting you down. And so this law changes the definition of imminent threat. So companies now, in the past, imminent threat meant that the DEA could go in and shut down a company. Now it's an immediate threat, and that's a very, very difficult bar to meet for the DEA.
Steve Ratner?
I confess this has not been in my field of vision, but just doing a quick search around Google a minute ago, it appears that this law passed the Senate unanimously, which is not something you see very often in Washington. So how should we think about that, assuming what I've said is correct?
Well, I mean, a lot of things get passed by, it's called UC in this town. And so our reporting shows that a lot of members of Congress didn't really understand what this bill did. They thought that it would do what the title says, and that's ensure patient access, improve drug enforcement, but it really does neither of those things. And I don't think a lot of people really read this bill and quite understood exactly what it would do. The lawyers who wrote this knew exactly what they were doing. They changed the language ever so slightly, but language matters in law, and by changing that language, they changed 40 years of law under the Controlled Substances Act.
Richard?
Is there any way that you can get the AMA or someone else, some other body, to limit what doctors are free to prescribe in this area? If the drug companies can't be blocked, if individuals can't be stopped from buying, can you get doctors stopped from overprescribing?
Yeah, I mean, that's where the problem begins, is doctors who are overprescribing and doctors who are selling prescriptions for cash. But the problem is that there are so many doctors who are doing that, and there are so many pain clinics and pain management clinics that are doing this. The DEA felt like they were playing a game of whack-a-mole. Every time they would hit a doctor, take down a pain clinic, another one would pop up immediately. And so they felt like they had to go up the food chain and start, making a difference by shutting down some of the companies that were sending these pills downstream.
Joe?
Yeah, there's another problem, Scott. Joe Scarborough here. There's another problem, too. You're talking about these pill clinics that were popping up. Also, psychiatrists aren't reimbursed by insurance companies for counseling, for talking to people. They're reimbursed basically for looking at them and writing a quick script, handing it to him, and have him go. I've heard this story time and time again about people who were prescribed the wrong thing, people that were prescribed, again, pain medication when they shouldn't have been prescribed pain medication. And it is, well, I guess what surprises me is this is so widespread. When my older boys were in college, I knew of 4, 5, 6 kids that they either knew or knew of that died of an overdose of this stuff from so-called good families. This wasn't just happening in darkened vans in South Florida. This is happening all across America. That's why it surprises me that Congress is actually not going to be more proactive in cracking down on what you've uncovered.
Yeah, it surprised us too, Joe. This is an epidemic that knows no bounds. There are very few degrees of separation now. Everybody knows somebody who has died or knows somebody who has died from this epidemic. My neighbor's son just passed away. A top DEA official, his grandson just died of an overdose. So it really knows no bounds. It knows no political parties. It's in almost every community community across the country, and it is a stunning turn of events for Congress to pass a bill that basically protects the drug industry from the DEA going after it. And we got access to a law review article that the DEA chief administrative judge has written. And we obtained that from the Marquette Law Review, and you can look it up. And he eviscerates this law and says this is the worst possible thing that Congress could do at this height of this epidemic. It takes away that immediate suspension tool, but it also weakens other tools that the DEA has in its toolbox.
The Washington Post, Scott Higham, thank you so much. An incredible piece of investigative reporting that everyone should read at WashingtonPost.com. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.